Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's a good thing nobody sat down in these seats because this is where the splash area is, right down here. So I'm Dale Rogerson. This is Jason Beaumont, and today we're going to be talking to you about how to add animations to your HTML JavaScript app so they don't look like crap. The talk's divided into two parts. Jason's going to talk for about the first 20 minutes on why we think animations are an integral part of the apps in the Windows 8 experience. And then in the last part of the talk, I'm actually going to take a HTML JavaScript app and add animations to it. Even if you're not interested in the HTML JavaScript and interested in some of the other platforms, the information that Jason has, I think, is very motivational into the importance of animations. Thanks, Jason.
Great. Thank you very much, Dale. It looks like we're still waiting to get some of the slides up on the screen. Yep. Will this help? There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jason Beaumont, and I'm a program manager on the team that is responsible for implementing the Metro design style in Windows 8. It's been a lot of fun. For the past few years, we've been working on adding animations, working on the touch language together, panning, zooming, and the visual personality of the system. And one of the most fun parts about it is my team's also responsible for creating features that allow developers to use the same personality that we've been building as well. And that's exactly what Dale and I would like to talk about today. We have a new feature in Windows 8 for developers that's called the Animation Library. And the Animation Library gives both XAML and HTML and JavaScript developers access to the same animations that we use in our apps and in the system. I'd like to give a tour of the library, talk about some of the animations that are included in it, some tips and tricks for using it, and then Dale's going to do some hands-on code examples of actually adding these animations to a sample app. I hope by the end of the session, everybody has a good idea of how to add beautiful Metro animations to their experience and some great guidelines on how to make them the most effective. Because animations are really important. They add beauty, energy, motion, personality to your app, to your experience. There's a big difference between an app with animations and without animations. If you think about this, it's true for almost any experience. If you think about a still of a movie versus seeing a movie in action, it's no coincidence that the feeling of motion adds so much. There's no coincidence that the word motion is inside of the word emotion. This is something that's absolutely integral. In fact, if you take a look at just a real simple example, this is a screenshot that I'm sure everyone in the room had seen for several months leading up to build. And I was like, okay, this is beautiful. There's nice typography here. There's vibrant colors. It's laid out well, nice use of a typographic grid. But it really isn't until you see it in motion and you see the updates about your own life coming in, animated gracefully across the screen, that it really feels alive, that it really feels like there's a wonderful kind of personality here. And that's exactly what animations do. They enhance an experience in so many ways. They make it clear where to focus. To use the movie example that we kind of talked about a little bit before, again, think about a camera in a movie scene and how it's almost like an actor, how it directs the energy of you as the viewer. If you think of a scene where two people are arguing and a camera can slowly move between it, or can cut really fast as people are arguing or discussing. That camera is directing your attention. It's directing your eye. It's creating a sense of energy, and it's telling you where the director, where the editor would like you to focus. Here's an example of that just in our own system. So I'm going to launch an app, and this is an animation that you guys have seen over and over again. Trust me, I've had to see it thousands and thousands of times as we winnowed it down. And the animation uses a little bit of a trick here. What it does is it quickly moves the tiles that are on the screen off the screen, fades them out, but does so in a way that doesn't draw your eye to it, because the majority of the energy, the majority of the motion on the screen has to be based on what you just tapped. It has to bring up the splash screen, because that's where we want to draw your attention as a viewer. So I'm just going to tap on the Build app real quick and just try to watch as the tiles fade out and think about where your eye is immediately drawn. So how quickly that happens? Very fast. You come in and your eye is taken over by the content that you want to pay attention to. And that is an example of an incredibly purposeful animation. It's an animation that conveys specific information. It's telling you exactly what to focus on. A great example of a purposeful animation in the system is when you're just dragging and dropping. Here's a number of animations that happen here. So let me just kind of tap on this Build app again. And this time I'm going to pull it down. And the first thing you'll see is that all the other tiles animate slightly behind it. So there's a little bit of information there saying, hey, we're on kind of another plane, that the tile that I've just touched is above the other ones, because that's exactly what it is. As I drag it around, you can see that it now exists above the other ones. And as I move it someplace that I can drop it, the other tiles animate out of the way, saying that this is a place. This is a place that it can be dropped. It's conveying information to the user. And if I move it somewhere where it can't be dropped and I let go, it purposefully and confidently comes back into the place that it should be. And that sort of confidence is really important. Animations can be used to create a sense of confidence in the system. Many of you for years have been using this all the time when you create a push button animation. You're telling the user, yes, you've successfully pressed this button, or you've depressed it. It's just a little animation, but it creates that sense of feedback. It helps reinforce that, yes, this is a button, and it can be pressed, and it works the way you think it does. That reinforcing is something that animations, especially in Metro, especially when you don't have some of the Chrome that users may be used to, is absolutely excellent at providing. As I flipped back and forth between these slides and the start screen, you may have noticed that every time the slides fly off to the left. So let's do it really quick. And then when I bring them back in, they come in from the left. And as you all know, since you've been using Windows 8 for the past few days, that's where apps kind of live after you use them. When you swipe in from the left, that's where the apps come from. So that animation is reinforcing this idea. It's telling you psychologically, yes, that app went away, but it's over here. And when you bring it back in, that's where it came back from. We had this really cool usability study while we were building these animations, where we brought a bunch of people in, and we had them sit down with some paper and some markers. And they hadn't used Windows 8 before. And we said, just draw Windows. Tell us, what does Windows look like? And they all drew pretty much what you and I would have drawn had we not used Windows 8 before. They drew a little taskbar at the bottom. They drew a Perl. They drew some icons. They drew the silhouette, a familiar silhouette of Windows. And then we had them use Windows 8 for a while. And after a couple hours of using it, we went through the same exercise and said, draw Windows 8. What does it look like? And they drew the start screen. They wrote the word start. They put boxes on there. But a number of them did something that was actually pretty special, that was a really neat signifier. They drew apps living off to the left. They drew a little app bar underneath the screen. They drew a little charms bar over to the right of it. The animations had created a cosmology. It had created a mental model for these people, that these things that they're not even seeing on the screen, we asked them to draw the screen, and yet they also drew things that don't live on the screen. The animations had reinforced that that is the way the system works, that that's where these things live. And that's why animations are so important to the Metro design style. When we were working on it at first, back in Seattle, we were drawing all these pictures of here's the Metro reimagining of Windows. And we'd kind of shop them around, and people would be like, yeah, it's good. It's really pretty. You guys are good at making pretty things. But, it looks a little sterile. It looks a little lifeless. And it wasn't until we went back and added animations to it and then started shopping those around that everyone's like, okay, I'm all in. I get it. I get why you're doing it. And that's when it really became clear that without animations, Metro feels like it's missing something. It doesn't feel alive and connected. And it's especially true for Metro apps that you're building, that they use animations as well. When Windows recedes into the background and your app becomes immersive, it becomes the full experience, there needs to be some threads that tie your app back to the system it's running on to make it feel like it's designed for the system, to make it feel like it's purpose-built for what the user is experiencing. This can be done through things like common controls, something that the user's familiar with. Styling, creating that silhouette, that typographic grid that Windows and our apps are based on. And it can also be built using animations. In addition, without that Chrome, you're missing some of the signifiers that users are used to about how something works. There's not an ever-present back and forward button, for example. So if you have an app that's all about reading news and you're panning back and forth between the multiple stories, you're going to need the animation to reinforce the idea that another news story lives over to the left or another news story lives over to the right, because you may not always have those controls present that people may be used to. So when you're building your app, think about ways that you can move Chrome off of the screen and use animations to create that same mental model that you would use and the same sort of usability and usefulness that maybe your Chrome or your controls would have in the past. So here's a quick demo of this, and many of you probably already saw this in Jensen's talk already, but this is a SDK sample, and we have a number of animation SDK samples that are up on the Dev Center, but this is one that I modified, much to my team's delight, and I removed animations from it. And so here's just a real simple scenario of adding or deleting items. And I'm doing it without any animation at all. It's kind of lifeless. In fact, it's actually kind of like hard to understand what's happening. The pictures just appear or disappear. They don't come from anywhere. They don't go anywhere. They're just there. In fact, the list itself just kind of pops. And when there's so many items on the list and things are added or deleted, nobody can quite tell if something's happening. No one can quite tell what's being added or deleted. But if you add just a few animations, real simple, adding and deleting animations, then all of a sudden, you get a lot more personality. And all of a sudden, this app begins to come to life. Notice how the pictures come from behind and they leave from the same place. There's now a sense of depth to the application. It's not completely flat. There's something else there. And then there's a neat kind of physics happening with this expand and collapse animation. So pay attention to this real briefly. As I'm going to add a picture to the list, notice what happens to the list before the picture comes into view. It makes room for the picture. The list expands, and then the picture comes into view. Let's do that one more time. And then when I delete, it goes away, and the list naturally collapses. Now, there's a couple ways that we could have gone with that design. You can imagine a picture pushing itself into view and ramming everything else around it, right? You can imagine like some other type of physics there. But the animation here, as simple as it is conveying a personality. It's saying like the system, this list, kind of knows your intent already. It's making room for you. It's making room for the action you just did. That's a key component to Metro animations. Luckily, you're not on your own trying to like poke around the system and add these yourself by trying to like deconstruct what our animators did. We just thought, well, why don't we just make the same animations available to all of you guys through our animation library feature? And that's what I'd like to spend the remainder of the intro talking about, is just a tour of the library, the animations it provides, and some of its capabilities. So at a high level, the Windows 8 animation library is just part of Win.js. Many of you probably already started using some of the templates. You see that there's something called Animation.js that comes along with it. And if you explore it, if you kind of pop that file open and start looking around, you'll see that it contains a lot of the key Metro animations you see throughout the system. These already have the pre-built-in storyboard values, curves, timing, etc. that we use. That way, when your app uses it, there's that sense of familiarity. There's a sense that the user has seen that kind of motion before, that sense of physics before. They know and expect what's going to happen. And these aren't like individual primitives. These aren't like little things that you have to then assemble and try to guess at what we were doing. Instead, what we did was we bundled these up into some common animation scenarios around navigating around your app, animating the content that's already in the view, revealing or hiding some of your controls or some of your UI that you have in your experience, and then some animations specifically for people who are building their own controls. So let's kind of look at some of these in detail and do like a little tour of some of the ones that are in here. And this isn't going to cover all of them in detail, but what we'll do is we'll just kind of have a couple examples of each scenario. And then afterwards, feel free to catch me if one of these kind of caught your eye and you'd like to learn a little bit more about it. So the first scenario is app navigation. And we have two animations in the library here. One is enter page, which is a way to animate your app first loading. So after the splash screen comes up, you may not want to just have your content pop into view as soon as it loads. You may want to animate that kind of gracefully in. The second is transition page. This is around navigating, an animation for navigating around different sections of your app. There's a difference between a Metro app and a web page in this way. A web page, you're going to click a link, the screen goes white, and then after everything loads, it kind of pops into view. But an app shouldn't feel like that. An app shouldn't feel like a web page. You're going to want some transitions that move between them. And that's exactly what the transition page animation does. Let's actually, before I move forward, why don't we just look at transition page in action? So I'll hop over here and I'll go to the build app, and I'll bring up the app bar, and let's click trip report and floor plan. So you can see that that could have just popped in, but instead we now have this kind of consistent, staggered settling into view. So once the content's actually in view, you'll probably want some animations to use for the actual content that's on the screen. And so we have ones here like transition content, which can be used to animate content that's still loading in. So imagine you have a page that's filled with a bunch of pictures, but not all of them are ready yet. So you don't necessarily want the pictures just to pop in as soon as you're ready to load. You probably want to orchestrate how they come into the screen. We have animations for revealing and hiding and repositioning content from one area to another. Or crossfade, which is a great way to update content, to show content changing from one to another without drawing a ton of users' eye attention to it. Remember, a lot of these animations have a variable scope on kind of a look at me scale. You don't always want your users' eyes to be drawn to every animation. Sometimes you just want to update something that's on the screen without drawing a lot of attention from an immersive part of your experience. And then another kind of fun animation here is this peak animation. And this is something that you can see really easily right on your start screen. And it's the animation that's used when all of your tiles are updating, which of course now they're doing. Okay, good. And you can imagine wanting to create a sense of familiarity in your own app by using that same animation to update some information that's on the screen. The next set of animations are pretty fun. They're what a lot of our controls like flyouts and the app bar use. And these are animations for bringing some of your controls in or out of the screen, for animating supplemental UI, as we call it in like nerd parlance. And here's some examples of this. If I go back to start again and I tap on my user tile, see how I animate in the flyout there. Or if I select an app, you see the app bar animating in and out from the bottom. Now what's cool is all of these animations are bookended animations. And that kind of ties back into that usability and confidence and reinforcing that we were talking about earlier. By animating from the same place and going back to the same place, the user's eye knows where something came from. It sets some expectations in their head about where these things kind of live. And they know that by doing something, they know visually beforehand where something will come from and where it will go back to. And finally, we have a big set of animations that are really for people creating custom controls around adding and deleting, dragging and dropping, selecting items. And the cool thing here is that you don't necessarily need to go and like rebuild all of these in your app. You can just use the built-in controls that we have in WinJS, like list view, that has all of these built in automatically. But if you're creating your own custom control, these can be really useful. And that way, it feels like some of the other controls that people have used on the system. So that was a quick tour of a lot of different animations. There's a lot more there. And I encourage you to check out the Windows 8 Dev Center. We wrote guidelines for all of these animations up there. And it wasn't just the engineers on my team that wrote it, it was also the artists. It was also our motion designers, our animators. We all partnered together to write guidelines that weren't just about how to implement the animation, like what specific function to call and the capabilities of the API, but also about how to use that animation effectively and how to make sure that you weren't confusing users with it. So definitely check that out. So that's enough of my little high-end intro. I think by now people actually want to see code and see how to do it themselves, and that's where Dale comes from. So my developer hidden behind the
dev in the box.
The dev in a box, yeah. And Dale's going to show us how to do some coding. So thank you, guys.
Thanks. Thanks, Jason. So again, I'm Dale Rogerson, a developer in the Windows 8 team that had the pleasure on working the technologies that underline the animation library. And I'm also pleased that I get to add animations to an app during the talk, which meant that I got to write an app to add the animations to. Now, I guess I'm in kind of a rut, because whenever I write an app for a new platform, or I need to teach somebody about writing an app, I usually do a tangram app, which is a Chinese puzzle. And a long time ago, when we had a PDC here, I think I gave a talk about MFC, and I did a tangram app for that, for people who remember MFC. And then when I did my book Inside Com, I did a tangram app for that was in C++ with OpenGL. So now I'm back, and we're going to have a tangram app today, but it's in HTML and JavaScript using the new platform. It's a simple app. It's pretty straightforward. You'll see you got 3 puzzles you can choose from to solve. And if we click or touch on the cat here, we go to another view of the app. And on the one side of the screen is the cat you want to solve, and on the other side we have these little shapes I can move around. And these Nikes have great touch. And I can even got the inertia hooked up in there, which is a lot of fun. And then another thing, if you're holding your device, you can switch the cat to the other side, so you use left-handed or right-handed or however. But you'll notice, as I click around on these things, the app is really lifeless. But we're going to fix that in this talk by adding animations to it. And so if we jump back in the slides here, we're going to add 5 different animations to the app. They're kind of in 3 groups. There's some selection-based ones when the user wants to select something. Then there are animations around navigating from the one view to the other view. And then finally, when we're changing the cat from the left of the screen to the right of the screen, we're going to do a reposition animation around that. So we'll go ahead and hop into this. The API for the first one we're going to cover is pointer down. So when the user clicks or touches on that puzzle, like the cat, we want to give the user visual feedback that that's happening. The API is written on the slide. It's straightforward, pointer down, and you pass the element you actually want to animate. Well, one thing I should mention, Jason did mention it, the animation library is part of the Windows library for JavaScript, the WinJS library. I'm sure you've heard about this in a lot of the other talks, but it's a great way to jumpstart your development, to speed it up. And the nice thing is it's got the Metro style built in, so it encourages that your apps to follow and feel like the rest of the system. And we'll go back to Visual Studio. Well, first, I'm going to put the first animation, the pointer down animation on this cat right there. So when you click on it, you'll get that feedback response to the user that you've clicked on it. So we'll go back into Visual Studio here. And this is, like a lot of the other apps you've seen at the talk, it was built using Visual Studio 11, using the templates, where you can select a starting template to build out the skeleton, and then you modify that template to get the app built. One of the things that happens a lot of times when you use templates or wizards or those things is you get a bunch of files and you don't really know where to start. And one thing I discovered is if you go to the manifest file, it gives you a little hint here with the start page being default.html. So I'll load up that file. This is default.html. And for the pointer down animation, it's going to be pretty straightforward to add that one in. For some of the other animations, we're going to have to modify the way the app navigates. And one of the differences about a Metro-style app written in HTML JavaScript compared to a web page or most websites is that instead of navigating from one page to another page to another page, and each one is a new state, one of the typical patterns you use is to load a single page, and then you modify the document object on that page. And that allows you to keep your JavaScript state without having to try to pass data across the navigational boundary. And the Visual Studio templates actually have a model for that they call fragment loading. And you'll see this div here is called content host. And that's actually where these fragments get loaded. And the first fragment that gets loaded is actually the HTML from this file, landingpage.html. Again, we're going to look at this when we do the navigation animations. But in this particular animation, we can jump directly to landingpage.html. And I'll load that one right here. And one of the other things that the Visual Studio template does for us is when it builds its file is it makes sure that we have the Windows JavaScript libraries included. And here's the Win.js libraries. And the ones that we're looking at today, animations.js, and as we'll see in a little bit, that's built on top of uli.js. Now, the file that we need to modify for our particular piece of code is landingpage.js. And we can open that file up really quickly. And again, what we're trying to do here is we want to add a pointer down animation. So when I touch or click on the cat, I get some feedback there. And we've unified touch and mouse pointer operations behind a new event, MS pointer down. I've already added an event listener for that. The handler is thumbnail pointer down. And conveniently, I have a little empty function here that doesn't do anything. So I can start typing Win.js. And the Windows.js library has this concept of namespaces. And we're in the UI namespace, and then under animations. And we're going to do a pointer down. We need an element, and this pointer will work for that. And we hit F5. The app comes back up. And when I click on the cat, you should see this little subtle scaling effect as the cat goes back in the screen. And we'll do that once again. So there you go. That's all you need to know about adding animations to your system. Now, there's more we can show. And in fact, that doesn't really tell you a lot about what the animation library is. I mean, I always hate when I come to these demos and somewhere like, look, I write one line of code and I've written Word. And you're like, OK, there's more behind Word than one line of code. So, and when we were coming up with a talk, we were like, well, how do we explain what the animation library is and isn't? And we decided the best way was to put a breakpoint in it and step down into it. So let's go back. We'll click on our friend the cat here. Fortunately, we hit the breakpoint. Step into that. And my highlights aren't super clear here, but we're in the, if you look up into the right hand of the screen, this is the animation.js file. And this is the function pointer down. And it's basically a wrapper around this execute transition function. And the execute transition function is taking two parameters. The first parameter is the element that we're going to animate. And the next set of parameters are a single structure. And watch me for you JavaScript guys out there. I'm going to probably go into COM and C++ terminology, but bear with me here. But we're passing this data to that function. And we're going to get into that data as we step through it. So let's go ahead and step in the next level. And now you'll see, if you look in the upper right, is the UI.js file is now the one we're in. And we're in this function execute transition. And a lot of this early code up in here is all about handling arrays of elements. And when we look at the transition animations, you're going to see that you can actually pass an array of elements and get this cool staggering effect. For this particular case, we have one element, so I'm going to quickly step over all the array manipulation. And we're going to get into this next function here where we have execute element transition is the next interesting function. So if you think of execute transition as handling the array, and execute element transition as handling an element in the array, that's a helpful way of thinking about it. So I'm going to step in the next thing. And this is where I get super excited. And that's the thing. Our VPs are always super excited. And they were teasing each other because we had a meeting one day, and everyone came on. I'm super excited. Although what makes it even better is they really were super excited. And I really am super excited, too, because these things here are setting style properties on the elements. And the style properties, if you look, MS transition property, MS transition delay, MS transition duration, these are setting the CSS3 transition property for this element. And part of the reason I'm excited is that's one of the technologies I worked on during Windows 8. So a quick overview for people who aren't familiar with CSS transitions is, as their name implies, they are CSS. And I have a file here. That code, those 4 lines of JavaScript, are essentially doing the equivalent of this CSS markup. Now, what a CSS transition does is, like normally, in this particular case, our transition is dealing with an MS transform property. And MS transform is a CSS proposal for doing 2-dimensional transformations on your objects. So you can skew them, scale them, rotate them, and all that stuff, or translate them. So, if we have our little bunny here, and we want our little bunny to translate over in another place, normally you're going to change that translation, and it's going to pop over there. So you're in one state, it pops over the other. When you define a CSS transition, it allows you to, instead of having it move from one place instantly to another, to actually transition to the new place over a period of time. In this particular case, we're going to make that transition happen immediately. There's no delay, 0 milliseconds delay. We're going to make it happen really fast, 167 milliseconds. So this is a coffee drinking rabbit. He's going to zoom over there. And then finally, we want to give the rabbit some personality for this movement. And we do that through this cubic Bezier curve. They're often called ease functions. Does the rabbit start up slow and then pick up speed? Or if he's really drinking caffeine, does he start off fast and then crash at the end? So that's kind of how the CSS transition works. There's tons of information out there about how to use these if you're not familiar with them. The one piece left is, in order for the bunny to actually move, you have to change the MS transform property. And so we're going to go back and look at the code to figure out where we're changing this property. So we'll go back to our code. And I happen to have cheated and stepped through this code before. And so I know it happens there. So I'm going to put a breakpoint there so that I make sure I don't skip over it. 2 things I want to point out before we hit F5 to execute. The first one is you might be wondering, well, you just showed me the CSS to do what the animation library does. Why don't I just use CSS? And for a lot of animations, CSS is great. It's a great technology to use on web pages. But in a lot of cases, for like an app experience, some of the animations, they're short-lived. They're not going to be there for the life of that element. You only need them like enter page. You only use it when the page enters. You don't want it around after that enters. So then you get in the business of you add the elements through CSS, and then you have to remove them. And that's what the animation library would do for you. And if we look down here as I scroll down, you'll see add event listener. MS transition end is the event that gets fired when the transition ends. And then it's going to end up calling onExecute transition end. As I scroll up, there's onExecute transition end, and one of the things it does is clear transition property. So all those properties end up getting removed when that animation ends. The other thing I want to point out is that we're creating this when.js promise object here. And the when.js promise is this cool pattern for attaching a functionality to a function. It basically gives you a nice model for doing asynchronous programming. So in this particular case, we're going to be able to attach a function to run when the animation ends. And we'll look at that in detail when we do the pointer down. And if I scroll down, you can see the promise object is actually returned from this. So we can hit F5. We'll hit our breakpoint. And then I'll step in. And you'll see we're actually back down to our pointer down function. And one of the parameters we passed into it here was the transition function. Like, what piece of code is going to actually trigger this transition? And in this case, we have a little wrapper called setTransform. It's actually going to do a scaling of down to 0.95, 0.95. And if we step into setTransform, you'll see, sure enough, this is where we've actually changed the MS transform property, and that's going to trigger that transition to happen. So again, the animation library is attaching the CSS transition properties, and then it's triggering that CSS transition to happen, and then it removes the properties after that. And if we come back to our slides here. So the three things I want to point out about what we just saw is for the pointer down animation, you saw that we had it was built on top of CSS3 transitions. All the animations in the animation library are built on top of either CSS3 transitions or animations, so it's all standards-based. The other thing is the pointer down was built on top of CSS transform. So the property we're modifying is a CSS transform property, which allows us to do the translation, or this particular case for pointer down, the scaling effect. The reason we pick CSS transform, and it's true for all the properties in the animation library, either CSS transform or opacity, is we don't have to relay out the whole page when we do that. The way the transform works is the div is laid out and then the transform is applied. So when you're doing like the little bunnies moving across the screen, the rest of the page is not getting recalculated. That ends up with better performance and smoother animations. Finally, we saw like the pointer down animation is 167 milliseconds. I believe that's 1/6 of a second. Your screen refreshes at 60 hertz, and that's 16.7 milliseconds. That's 10 screen refreshes. So these are short animations, and it's very important that the animations are short, that they don't get in the way of the user. And as we're going to see in a little bit, in some cases, you'll have to serialize behavior behind an animation, and you don't want to be blocking the user feeling like they're waiting forever for your animation to complete. So we just saw the pointer down, and now we need to match that with a pointer up. So we'll jump back into the code. And we'll stop the debugger here. And we just go back to the same file we were in before, which is landingpage.js. Similar to our pointer down, we have a pointer up method. And I have my little cheater code in this toolbox over here, so I don't make as many mistakes. And I could just put the pointer up function call in there. But the issue with doing that is the navigate that happens next is going to be happening at the same time the pointer up is happening. And even though the pointer up animation is short, you're going to be in the situation where the navigation is possibly removing elements that you're trying to animate at the same time, and the appearance isn't going to be smooth or pleasant. So when I talked about the pointer down animation, we had looked at and seen that there was this when.js promise object that was created. And I had said that that was a good way to do, to attach functionality when an animation finishes. So let's go ahead and see what that code would look like. And I will put the then function in. And basically, the pointer up is going to return the promise object. The promise object supports the function then, and the then function, you can pass several functions to it, but the one we're looking at here is a completion function. So you can pass a function to it that will get executed when the pointer up or the promise finishes. In this case, we're going to execute the navigate call. So while I'm in here modifying this code, I want to go ahead and modify the selection of the other cat on my other page. That work happens to be on tangrampage.js. Similarly, I have a puzzle pointer down method there, and I'm going to put the same pointer down call in there, and then I'm going to put a pointer up. It has the same code for handling the promise, and then I need to close my promise off, so we'll do that. Then I hit F5, and now when we see when I click on the cat, you should see the animation. It'll scale down, scale up, and then we'll switch to the next page. So down, up, next page, down, up, and then we have the relay out. And I can do that one more time. And that was that. So the big takeaway from this is that you can use the promise object that is returned from most of the animation library functions to chain your functionality so that the proper visual appeal happens and that you're not having animations trying to run on elements that are disappearing. So that shows our selection ones, both pointer down, pointer up, and a lot of apps, one of the things that would be good with this app would be to rewrite it, so instead of using just divs for those first 3 puzzles, in a more realistic scenario, we could actually have a list view there with a bunch of puzzles in it, and the list view already supports pointer down and pointer up, and you wouldn't even need to implement those. Well, let's change gears now and move from the selection animations to the navigational animations, and the first one we're going to look at is the inner page one. And inner page takes a set of incoming elements, and then it has an offset. We're going to use the default offset for that and just supply the incoming elements. And one of the things with the inner page is it's for that first time the user sees your content. It is only animating the stuff that you're telling it that's coming in. So if there's anything there, it's not going to animate that. You can divide the content up into these regions. And again, when we were looking at the pointer down, I said you could pass an array of elements in there. So if you pass like 3 elements in this kind of a layout here in the center where you have a title area, maybe a left nav, and then a content area, or in the case of our one page, it's going to be a title bar, the puzzle I want to solve, and then the canvas with the puzzle pieces on it. Those are going to stagger in. You're going to get the title bar coming in first, then the puzzle piece, and then the pieces you use to solve it. They're all going to animate at the same time, but there's going to be an offset, which gives it a nice effect. And if we go back to our code, well, actually, let's look at the sample, and you'll see right now, when I switch pages, there is no animation. So we're back in the debugger here, and let's exit that. And this is at the beginning of the talk where I talked about how there is a fragment loading concept in Visual Studio, and that we have the single default HTML page is alive for the whole thing, and we're replacing the content host element when we navigated. So the code associated with navigation is actually in the default.js file, and this is that function navigated here. It's going to clone the element, the fragment that we want to load. Then it's going to it actually uses a promise too, so when that cloning finishes, then it's going to run this code in here. It gets the content host. If anything's there, it clears it out. It then appends the fragment to the host, fixes up focus, makes sure the back button is in the proper state, and then it sends an event called fragment appended that the fragments can listen to. And in our particular application, the fragment, the canvas where we have the puzzle pieces on it that we can solve the puzzle, that's actually rendered. It's a canvas element, and the code for drawing that actually happens in the response to the fragment appended event. So we need all that to be done before we run our animation, and the queue event doesn't return a promise, so the way to kind of get around that is we're going to queue another event. And this is event, it's just a custom event. I'm going to make it up. course, it's pre-made up here. I called it my start animation, so we've queued the event. Doesn't do us much good to queue an event if we don't have a listener for the event, so we'll put a listener in, and then we actually need to define the listener itself. And there's that. I went ahead and removed the listener after I've handled it because I don't need it after that. And then now, all those little lines of code I just put in were really about when is this fragment finished and done. Now that it's all there, I can actually call my inner page function. And there's inner page. And I'm going to pass it the array of elements like I was talking about before. A bunch of different ways you can do this. And what I did was I added these class names to my divs. And I'm using class names instead of ideas. Like one of the reasons for that is that since this is a fragment, you could actually have the same fragment on a page multiple times. And then you use the class ID so that you don't get the conflicts there. Then if we go back to default.js, I just need some code to get those class IDs for me. I wrote a little function called getAnimate, and there's that function. The JavaScript gurus out there could totally optimize this, but we're just looping through and grabbing animate section class IDs. So now if I hit the F5 on that, you see that the three puzzles slid in. And if I go to the next page, you look, the cat comes in, the puzzle comes in. Look at the title when we go back. The title, then the three puzzles come in. It's got a really nice, elegant feel to it. So the first thing there was you had to do a little bit of code just to make sure everything was loaded and ready for the animation. Once it was all ready, then we just passed the array of elements in. We got that cool staggering effect. Now, as Jason said and I've said before, the inner page is really only for that first page of content. I just showed it to you on every page. The reason for this is inner page only animates the incoming elements. It doesn't do anything with the existing elements. For that, we want to go to transition page. Transition page is going to do a opacity fade on the existing content and then bring in the new content. And the big difference between inner page is you have the outgoing elements. And this is for when the majority of their content on the page is changing. If we were just going to change like just the cat or just the boat or one of those things, we would use a transition content just to change that one piece. Most of the code we're going to write now is going to be written because we have to keep the elements that were going to go away, we have to keep them around for the life of the animation. So we'll go back to the code here. Exit out of the debugger. And let's see if I can select the right line there. So we only want inner page to happen on the first page. So what we're going to do is put an if statement around that. And there's our if statement. And I had a lot of fun getting all these indentions right, only to have them not be right. But there we go. We have is first page, inner page. But so now, if it's not the first page, we're going to do the transition page. We got our sections coming in. We got our sections going out. Except if we come up here, we'll see we don't have sections going out because we got rid of them as soon as we loaded the new fragment in. So we got to fix that up. Again, it's JavaScript, it's HTML. There's a bunch of different ways you can do this. It will depend on the app you have. The method I chose, I'm going to make two content hosts. I got content host A, content host B, and I'm going to flip-flop between them. And here we go. I got code to do that flip-flop. Again, it's not rocket science. It's is first page is if the two hosts are empty. Host in and host out are this concept I have for the new one versus the old one. Whichever one is empty ends up being host in. And then I have to do some fix up because I don't have host anymore. I also have two 2 back buttons on my page. So I need to change that to host in. Here's another host in. And then hiding down here is another one. And so now that's good. I've kept the new content. So the new content's in host in, the old content's in host out. But now my old content lasts forever, which was really interesting when I was working on this. I'm like, hey, why is the old content still around? Well, that's because I didn't get rid of it. So we got to get rid of it. And then we want to get rid of it after transition page finishes. Our buddy, the promise, comes back, and we clear out the host out element with the, setting inner HTML to null. So that gets us animate section ins done. We have a section now to animate out. We just need to supply the array for it. And I'm going to do that the same way I did the other one. And I have a little cheat here. Don't look at this. This is fixing a bug. It's actually, we have a problem where the opacity doesn't always end at the right value. So to ensure the opacity is 0 at the end, I set it 0 at the beginning. OK, if I added everything I was supposed to add, we should see the inner page is right there. So the next one, it's very subtle, but the pages are going to, there's an opacity fade, and then the new content comes in. If you kind of just try to look at the whole page at one time, you'll notice the fade out a little bit more. But it's really a fast fade out. And if you look at the puzzle piece, it's a little bit more noticeable there. So that gets us back to, the hardest part about that is actually getting the pieces to stay around. And one of the things is, in terms of making sure that you can do these animations, is that you structure your app so that you can keep some of the elements around. And we don't think that the animations are icing on the cake or extras or add-ins. They're an integral part of your app, and you've got to plan for that. So when you first start writing your app, go ahead and start adding the animations in from day one. And this will assure that the day before you upload it to the store and you're trying to get your animations working, you're like, I don't have the performance in my rendering in order to get these smooth animations. So plan for them really early. Then finally, we have a create reposition animation. And if that's the one right here, when I click on the cat flops to the other side. It's not clear what's happening here. There's no real indication. The cat disappears and he's in a new place. But the reason we're going to show this one is it's a different calling conventions from the other ones. It's a 3-step calling convention. You first call create reposition animation. That's step 1. You then reposition your elements, step 2. You then call animation execute, step 3. And animation is the object returned from create reposition animation. What's happening is, again, if we have our friend the bunny, we're going to move the bunny over here, create reposition animation stores the bunny's offsets. You then move the bunny to the new location, and then when you call animation execute, it actually determines the delta between the bunny from where he was in the first place to where the bunny was in the new place. And then he fakes the old place by doing a transform translate, and then it then animates from that to the final position. So again, we're using the CSS transforms for that. And this actually goes in really nicely. That page, again, is tangrampage.js. We're in the pointer up, and this is where I have code. I basically changed the class ID to get the thing from one side of the screen to the other. I'm going to have to get out of the debugger here and find the right piece of code. I need to build an array of elements. I have the 2 elements, the shape and the puzzle. Then I create the animation and pass the elements to it. And then finally, we just call animation execute. We press F5. We already have a nicer feel with the inner page. Our transition page feels pretty good. And then now we have visual feedback where that cat's going. It's not just you're shocked that the cat's in a new position, but that you actually get this nice cross animation there. Yeah. So animations add beauty, energy, motion, and personality to your app.
Great. Thank you, Dale. So that was pretty fun, wasn't it? I mean, if you take a look at it, the actual code we added to our app was pretty small. We added just a few lines of code to actually add a lot of animations. The animation library did a lot of that work for us and made adding those animations simpler. And I hope that now that you've seen kind of the Tangram app before and after, you're excited about adding some great animations to your app. Some takeaways are to remember that animations are there to provide clarity. They should be purposeful. They should add confidence. They should help reinforce the system. They should make your system beautiful and filled with personality. And if you just use the animations from the animation library, you'll get that for free. You'll get the same animations that we use in our apps, in the system, that other people will be using. You'll create that sense of familiarity, that your experience is built for Windows. We use best practices, so you don't need to worry about learning a lot of performance tips and tricks or tuning the animations. We've already built a lot of that into the animation library as it is. And then if you hop up to the Windows 8 Dev Center, there's a lot of great guidelines there already about the great ways to use animations and how best to use them in different circumstances. So real quick, I'd like to talk about some of our most popular animations that are inside of the animation library. Now, we know these are popular because we've already seen people building apps. We had the interns on campus. We saw what apps they were building and what animations they use. And so here's a quick overview of what those are. We talked about crossfade earlier. This is a great animation to use when you want to transition one piece of content to another without creating a big distracting movement. You just want to update something without drawing someone's eye to it. Fade in, fade out. This is something that's great for bringing controls on or off of your canvas. You don't always want these things on your canvas. You want the content to shine. But you will want to sometimes bring elements in or out, and fade in, fade out is a great way to do that. Enter page we just saw getting added to our Tangram app, and same with transition page. Transition content is good for adding elements that are still loading. So if in our Tangram app, if we had additional puzzles that still needed to be loaded off a disk or from the cloud, if you want to bring those in an orchestrated way, transition content's a great way to do that. Expand collapse was that animation I was showing earlier in the list where we were adding and deleting items to it, and the list was making way for the content. And then finally, we notice a lot of people like to add a lot of the different add and delete animations. We actually have a few different variations of add and delete in the animation library for if there's real fast add or fast delete scenarios. Maybe if you have like search results versus something maybe where you're adding or deleting a photo, for example. So that's really all the content that we have for today. There's some related sessions here. Definitely recommend checking out the Building High Performance Metro Style apps. But really the way I want to end is we're going on a journey together for the next few years, and we're all going to be building some great apps together. And I hope that you use animations to make them beautiful, to add personality, and to really delight our users. So thank you all very much. Have a nice week.